sometimes teachers take an approach of wait and see, and they want to give the child time to see if the literacy supports are having an effect, which can be a good idea for a short period of time, but if it extends on year to year, then we can be wasting that child's time. The other thing that can happen is that children might be referred on for an assessment when maybe there is other factors at play. So before we even look at a checklist with a teacher, it's a good idea to have a think yourself about, has that child had a gap in their attendance at school? Have they missed 6 weeks of phonics intervention because they were sick or on holidays? So how is their attendance in general in terms of their frequency and regularity in attending their phonics lessons? Has that child recently had their hearing tested and their eyesight tested, and could those factors be impacting how they're getting on with their reading and writing skills? Another really important area to look at is family history, and we talk about this in quite a bit more detail in the other video I did about ESL versus dyslexia, so I'll put a link in that video in this comment section. I won't go into too much detail about that now in this particular video, but if you want more information on that, please feel free to have a look at that other video. So once we've ruled out that some of those basic things are not at play, then it's good to have a think about what to look at, and this is where the checklist can guide us. And when we look at children with dyslexia, they can present in different ways. So I'll give you an example of two children that I've worked with recently. So I'll just put different names to them to protect their confidentiality. But our first child, his name is Ayaan. He's a 7-year-old boy and he loves dinosaurs. He's really chatty. He's a confident and smart little child, as his teacher would refer to him. So with Ayaan, he is presenting with more of a typical phonological processing difficulty in his dyslexia profile. The first area that we would look at is his phonological processing skills and phonological awareness. So this are things like, how is he able to identify rhyming words? Can he produce rhyming words? Can he segment sounds at the beginning of words, at the end of words? Does he find it difficult to move sounds around in words? And phonological awareness is a really core indicator that a child may go on to develop a diagnosis of dyslexia. It's one of the earliest warning signs or red flags that we have in terms of screening. So this is a good thing to do with children of that age, that we can determine whether they've picked up the phonological awareness skills in line with the rest of the children in the class. And if not, that's a good thing to check off on the screening tool. So with Ayaan, he is struggling with his phonological awareness skills. He's struggling to identify sounds in words. He's struggling to move sounds around in words and to identify syllables, rhyming words. So from the get-go, we have that information that gives us an idea that maybe there is something more significant at play for Ayaan. The next skill area we look at is letter sound association. So how well a child is able to pair up a letter and a sound together. With a child like Ayaan, he will do well in that in isolation, but then when it moves into more extended reading, we see that this fluency is breaking down. So when he's asked to maybe say the name of a letter or what's the sound associated with that letter, generally he can do that okay, but then as the word lengths increase, it's taking him a long time and a lot of effort to sound out each of the letters in that word. If we look at the profile of another student called Omar, who's aged 10, Omar is able to sound out letters and words. His phonological awareness skills are relatively okay. So Omar is 10, he's at a different stage in terms of the expectations for his reading and writing. His main issue is that he is struggling to build the fluency of his reading. Again, in isolation, when he's able given time, he can sound out letters and words, but because the expectation for Omar is that he will be able to read connected sentences at this stage, he is really falling behind his classmates. And if we delve a bit deeper into his overall profile, we will see that he is a child that's struggling with what we refer to as rapid automatized naming. And this is where a child's overall fluency is impacted, not specifically for reading and words, but across other areas as well. And it can be an area that takes a bit longer to see progress when we do an intervention program. We can make improvement, but the type of approach that we follow will be different to purely phonological processing difficulty, which is more in the area that Ayaan, our first child, fell into. So for Omar, he may also have some phonological processing difficulties, but alongside that, he has processing difficulty, and that impacts his fluency then in how he is reading. Other areas that we look at then are the child's ability to decode words and recognise words. Again, linking that back to fluency. How do they get on with sounds and words in isolation? Is it to do with a word in a sentence? Is that where things break down? And maybe it's to do with the grammar markers on words. Some children may struggle with, for example, endings like the past tense ed, they may drop that, or other prefixes and suffixes. For example, the word contagious, they may drop the first part, the con part in that word, or if it's to do with, again, a regular past tense ending, or maybe if the suffix full is there, so helpful, mindful, they may drop those final markers on the word that impact the meaning of the word. And then what happens is, for a child like Omar, for example, when he's at that 10-year age, a lot of the expectations around reading comprehension are increasing across multiple subjects. So he now needs to have vocabulary to enable him to access science and history and geography, and the ability to develop that vocabulary store and accurately read the words that he's been shown is really important for him to be able to understand the content that he's expected to learn. So this becomes more of a significant issue as the child is progressing through each grade level at school. When we think about fluency, and this was something with Omar's profile that we highlighted already, we want to look at things like the prosody, so how well does a child pause at the appropriate place in a sentence. When we don't do that appropriately, we lose the meaning in what we're reading and how we read aloud to another person. We look at things like automaticity, so how long does it take a child to become fluent in some reading target that they're working on. We also look at things like the comprehension and fluency integration. So is the child able to read for meaning in a sentence, for example? Are they reading it at a pace that allows them to draw the meaning of what they're reading? Are they reading accurately? And this also builds into fluency. So if a child is making lots of mistakes as they read through content, then obviously that's going to impact their overall comprehension of what they're reading, but also the fluency of the text that is being read will be lost because of that. And then how well does a child show endurance in reading? Are they able to read a couple of words, and then when it goes to sentence level, things break down over time? So these are markers that enable us to draw a picture of this child's overall level of fluency and to pinpoint that as something that needs to be worked on, for example, as part of a program. And when we are looking at a profile like Ayaan's, for example, and we know that phonological awareness is going to be a particular area of need for his profile, this would be something that we would prioritise as part of his programme. He would need repeated practice on certain sounds, and over time, when we build up the automaticity with those sounds, we will move him on to the next developmentally appropriate sound in the sequence that we're working on. And what we want to do is give him lots of repeated practice to build up that fluency and automaticity. We would use multisensory approach to do that. Research shows that this is the best way to teach children in a phonics-based intervention program, because it helps to establish some of the pathways in our brain when we use different sensory input to support the reading and learning of those specific letter sound correspondences. With Omar's program, then we're looking at more of an accuracy and automaticity side of things. So that's building up the fluency, like we spoke about before. Given that Omar is age 10, obviously the demands and expectations are greater for him. So alongside looking at some of his phonological processing skills, we're also trying to build up the fluency with which he's working through some of his literacy targets on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. Okay, so we'll just go back to then the screening tool once more, and some of the other sections we would look at. So we've talked about phonological awareness, we've talked about letter sound correspondence, we talked about word recognition and decoding, building fluency. Another important area is to look at spelling. And if children are making errors with spelling, it can give us an indication of where their phonological processing is at. For example, for Ayaan, he's spelling words like said as SED, and that tells us that he has quite a strong phonological representation of what the sound to word correspondence should look like, but he is making a mistake there. So we would need to work on certain types of tricky words with Ayaan, but it does tell us that based on the type of mistakes that are being made, where the breakdowns may be happening. And when, as I mentioned before, if a child is having difficulty with the grammatical components of the word, for example, then this gives us information about what area we may need to work on with that child specifically. So we have to take their individual profile into consideration and then build the program around what they need at this point in time. We also look at written expression, and this is a demanding task for any child because they're trying to put together all the components that they've learned. It involves a combination of fine motor skills, being able to space words appropriately so that we don't lose meaning. It involves understanding and labelling vocabulary accurately, being able to put sentences together and structuring them appropriately. There's many things that have to come together to enable a child to write a full sentence. And often we see with children with dyslexia that there is a mismatch between what they're able to say and explain when they're asked to give their opinion or to discuss things in the classroom. For example, if I was to ask Ayaan about dinosaurs, he could tell me lots and lots of different pieces of information and facts about different dinosaurs. But when I ask him to put that into writing, we immediately see that he's putting short sentences together, and it's not aligned with what I know he is capable of telling me about this subject. And that's a really significant marker for us to decide whether, okay, this child is definitely showing a discrepancy between what he can put onto paper and what he's able to say when the demands of writing and spelling are not there. So again, it gives us a good indication as to whether this child may need some further evaluation, and to see someone like myself, an educational psychologist, who might need to diagnose for dyslexia. When we are finishing up then completing the screening tool, and you've looked at all these sections and you have a gauge of where that child in your class is in terms of their profile. It's good to then look at giving more specific examples so that it will further highlight what areas are that child is finding difficult. For example, we might give the specific examples of where his phonological awareness skills are breaking down, how he's spelling particular words, what words he struggles to read, and making notes of those examples can be really helpful when it's referred on to an educational psychologist to do the assessment, because it can hone in where the most likely difficulties are arising, and it makes it easier to evaluate then those areas and give them more priority. With a child like Omar, then we would have to highlight the fluency, and this is something that can be missed, and to ensure that we put a program together that enables a student like Omar to make progress, we have to make sure that there is some emphasis put on building fluency and automaticity and that processing speed in the program. For a child like Omar, when I see him at the start of the week and he's reading a short paragraph, then when he has that repeated practice by the end of the week, so by the Friday, there's a marked improvement in his reading fluency. So we know that the program is working then for him because we are seeing measurable gains. For Omar's program, we may also consider giving him additional technology supports like text-to-speech software, for example, because in that way we're safeguarding his language development. He's still able to access reading comprehension. He might use technology to enable him to type and spell check some of the sentences that he's producing. And while we still work on developing those isolated skills, we want to also give him the opportunity to show us what he knows. And it's good to take that into consideration as well, depending on the child's age and stage, and also the type of difficulties that they're having. What we don't want is to have a child experiencing failure for an extended length of time and checking out of the whole process and not being interested in developing skills because they've had such a negative experience up to that point. What we want to do is give them the skills and the intervention as quickly as we can if we can identify that that child needs help in that particular area. So once you've done the screener, then you're able to think about, okay, this child does need to be referred on to someone else. But then at times you might think, actually, they haven't checked off enough of these areas for me, and I don't think that this child is appropriate for a full assessment. And then perhaps they may need some intensive literacy support first. Again, if we go back to the start, when we talked about children having gaps in their attendance at school, also if there's no family history of literacy difficulty, maybe they need to have their eyesight or hearing checked. And when those things are done, it can be something that doesn't need specialist input to overcome. So I hope you found this content helpful, and I hope that you might find the checklist helpful to use with some of the students in your class. If you're interested in learning more about this area, we are running some training courses, both in person and online. So I will put a link to that in our comment section. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.